I want you to think back to when you were just 14 years old. What were you doing and what was your life like? Me, I was a freshman in high school, and my biggest challenges were acne, trying to impress girls, and making sure I got my homework done on time. And I pretty much failed at all three. That's okay, though. I had a roof over my head, 3 square meals a day, and the most traumatic thing I ever had to witness was, I don't know, maybe seeing one of my fellow classmates getting shoved into a locker. Sadly, things wouldn't be quite so easy for Olive Oatman. Our family left Illinois back in 1850, bound for what they thought was the promised land, which, as it turns out, was just an inhospitable desert. Of course, by the time they realized their mistake, they had already been traveling for months. Just one man, his heavily pregnant wife, and their 7 children, the recently turned 14-year-old Olive among them. A family all alone in the middle of nowhere, on the verge of starvation and stranded hundreds of miles from their destination. And that's when disaster struck. In the span of just a few short minutes, Olive watched as nearly every single member of her family was slaughtered in the most brutal way imaginable. Only she and her 8-year-old sister were spared, and for the next several years they'd be held as captives. When Olive finally emerged, she was forever marked, both physically and mentally, a young lady not truly belonging to either culture. Or as a friend would describe her, a grieving, unsatisfied woman who somehow shook one's belief in civilization. Join me today as we take an in-depth look into Olive Oatman. Who was she? Why did her family decide to head west? And what was life like in captivity? And what about those tattoos? What did they really mean? Are the rumors true about Olive being married into the tribe? And did she really leave children behind when she was rescued? My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. Olive Ann Oatman was born in Hancock County, Illinois on September 7th, 1837. Her parents, Royce and Mary Ann, operated a dry goods store before settling down on a farm outside of Fulton. And from there, the family just continued to grow. Now, it's important to note that the Oatmans were Mormon, and their faith would play a major role in future decisions. To be more specific, they were Brewsters, a Mormon sect that began in 1837 after 11-year-old James Collin Brewster had a series of divine revelations, one of which designated the confluence of the Colorado and Gila rivers as the Promised Land. According to Brewster, it would be a Mormon utopia known as Bashan, a temperate and Eden-esque paradise with lush and fertile land, where they could not only govern themselves, but worship as they pleased. And yeah, I did just say the confluence of the Colorado and the Gila rivers. In other words, this lush paradise was to be located roughly in the same location as present-day Yuma, Arizona, an area that Mark Twain described as the hottest place on earth. Story goes that back in them days, the only thing separating Yuma from hell was a thin sheet of sandpaper. Now, in Prophet Brewster's defense, there were others around this same period who were also peddling southwestern Arizona as a veritable heaven on earth. Case in point, a travelogue from 1847 describing the area as follows. Broad, rich, and well-timbered. Everything in the shape of vegetation attains a lusty size, amply evincing the exuberant fecundity of the soil producing it. There are many sweet spots in the vicinity of both these streams, well deserving the name of earthly Eden. Man here might fare sumptuously, with one continual feast spread before him. The natives, for the most part, may be considered friendly or at least not dangerous. End quote, and my goodness, sounds wonderful. Only problem is the guy who wrote it had never been any further south than Taos, New Mexico. He didn't have a clue what that part of Arizona was truly like, and sadly, neither did Brewster or any of his followers, something that the Oatmans would end up learning the hard way. In 1848, Brewster helped to form the Church of Christ, sort of what he hoped would be a successor to the Church of Latter-day Saints. Now, before anyone emails me, there have been many different churches throughout the years who also refer to themselves as the Church of Christ. This was just one of the many. A few months later, Brewster began publishing a monthly newsletter discussing his would-be promised land. And by February of 1850, Olive's father announced that they'd be joining Brewster on the journey west. By the way, it doesn't really look as if the official Church of the Latter-day Saints really cared all that much for this Brewster kid. Guess they figured he was sort of a budget bin Joseph Smith, and even worse, he was against polygamy. Before it was all said and done, Brewster would get himself excommunicated. But to be honest, I'm not entirely sure if that was before or after the tragic fate of the Oatmans. I will say this much, though. Despite that part of Arizona being a hell on earth back in 1850, it turns out that Brewster's prediction wasn't completely wrong. He was just off by several decades. Stick around to the very end and I'll explain more. Pretty interesting little twist to this entire story. Now, like I said, Olive's daddy bought into Brewster's doctrine hook, line, and sinker. Ended up selling the family farm, purchasing a pair of wagons, and by May of 1850, he and the family departed for Independence, Missouri. It's there where they linked up with Brewster and the others. Some 80-plus hopefuls bound for the land of Bashan. Be that as it may, they wouldn't actually begin their journey until early August, which, if you've ever played the Oregon Trail, ain't exactly the optimal time to be heading off into the wilderness. Other than a late start, though, it was pretty smooth sailing, at least initially. The men didn't have no trouble locating game, they took Sundays off to observe the Sabbath, and when they camped out, there was often music and dancing. But as I'm sure you've already hypothesized, things would not remain so idyllic. First off, the then just 24-year-old prophet, James Brewster, turned out to be kind of a dick. Or, as historian Margot Mifflin put it in her book, The Blue Tattoo, Brewster proved to be a contentious and unlikable zealot. Olive's father wasn't exactly the easiest person to get along with either. At least one member of the wagon train would recall Royce as being a, quote, fine fellow enough in most respects, but sinfully reckless and a most dangerous companion. And surprise, surprise, it wouldn't take long for Royce and Brewster to start butting heads. Remember, they had their eyes set on southwestern Arizona, but somewhere along the way, Brewster changed his mind. Or I guess according to him, God changed his mind, and said they should just instead find themselves a place there in New Mexico along the Rio Grande. Finally, the entire party just decided to split up. Brewster and around 30 of his most faithful headed south to Santa Fe and eventually settled near the village of Socorro. The others, now led by Olive Oatman, continued west. According to Olive, who had just turned 14 about a month prior, quote, these were the beginnings of our sorrow. Inclement weather, swollen streams, hostile tribes, scarcity of provisions, and failing teams were among the difficulties we began to meet. And yeah, sure enough, 2 of the Oatman horses were stolen in mid-October, either by bandits or hostile natives. As far as I know, they never did figure out who the culprits were. Then, just a month later, one of their party, a guy by the name of Asa Lane, lost his fight with tuberculosis. This was not the first death they had experienced, by the way. Mr. Lane's daughter had passed 2 months earlier, also from tuberculosis. And due to a lack of available timber, each of the families contributed boards from their wagons to construct her casket. By the time her daddy passed, though, there weren't enough wagon boards to go around, so they just wrapped him up in a blanket and stuck him in the dirt. And then it began to snow. Thankfully, they lucked out and found a well-timbered area to wait out the storm. Unfortunately, it was in said timbered area where some Apaches made off with 2 of the oxen belonging to Olive Oatman. If you'll recall, the Oatmans began the journey with 2 wagons. But now, minus those oxen, they'd be forced to abandon one of them altogether, including everything that was in it. Needless to say, Royce was not a happy camper. He began pushing the remaining animals relentlessly, barely even stopping to let them graze until they finally reached the village of Santa Cruz. Now, I'll spare you all the details so we can go ahead and get on to Olive's story, but the wagon train would split up twice more, once in Tucson and then again at the now ghost town of Maricopa Wells. They most likely would have stayed put there in Maricopa Wells, just like their companions ended up doing, but the Oatmans were almost completely out of provisions. To make matters worse, there wasn't anything to eat at Maricopa Wells, thanks to a long winter drought and recent attacks by the Apache. And besides, even if there was something to buy, Royce was out of money. According to Olive, quote, the decision to leave Maricopa Wells was a severe trial to my father. If he went on, he must now go alone with his helpless family and expose them to the dangers of the way. And if he remained, starvation and perhaps death from the treacherous savages would be their fate. End of quote. So yeah, from that point on, it was just the Oatmans. Like I said earlier, 1 man, his wife, and 7 children, ranging in ages from 1 all the way up to 17. Also keep in mind that Olive's mother was about ready to pop with baby number 8, which was yet another reason why Royce was in such a hurry. Now just an FYI, but Royce had been warned repeatedly about the indigenous to the west. They, just like everyone else, were starving following that drought. As such, even the quote-unquote friendly tribes were taking desperate measures to feed their families. Also, you gotta think about when and where all of this was occurring. It hadn't even been a full year since John Glanton and his gang of scalp hunters were massacred at Yuma Crossing, the same place where the Oatmans were looking to settle. I mean, hell, the Yuma War was still officially ongoing. And then, of course, you had the ever-present threat of the Apaches. And despite all of these red flags, Royce was still determined to hit the road. I guess he figured after coming all the way from Illinois, the next 200 miles wouldn't be that big of a deal. Also, Royce's worries somewhat lessened after he had a chance encounter with an entomologist named John LeConte. Now, this LeConte guy was a character, in addition to being one traveling son of a bitch. Entomology, of course, is the study of insects, and John's specialty was beetles. Dude traveled all over the world in search of beetles, from Europe to the Middle East and even the American Southwest. When he and Royce met up, LeConte had just arrived in Maricopa Wells from Fort Yuma, and according to LeConte, he had seen absolutely no trace of Native Americans along the trail, either hostile or friendly. And I guess that was all the assurance that Royce needed to push off alone. To his credit, though, he had given up the idea of putting down roots in Arizona. Instead, he was planning on pushing all the way to California, but they'd still need to pass through Fort Yuma to get there. And unfortunately, things would not go as planned. They weren't on the trail for more than a couple of days before Royce came to the stark realization that his team weren't in no shape to pull a wagon. And what's more, the food situation had not improved a damn lick. Hell, Royce had even put everyone on a ration of just a biscuit and a half per day. Literally everything they owned was in that one remaining wagon, and it was just basically stuck out in the middle of the desert. A very hostile, unforgiving desert. As luck would have it, that's about the time they were reunited with LeConte. The entomologist was on his way back to Fort Yuma, and Royce gave him a letter to the post commander asking for help. The note read, in part, quote, "I am under the necessity of calling upon you for assistance. There is my wife and 7 children, and without help, sir, I am confident we must perish." End quote. Now, LeConte was a nice enough guy, and he readily agreed to deliver the dispatch. And since he didn't have a whole lot to haul other than his bug-gathering gadgets, he was able to make pretty good time. Just to give you an idea how fast he was traveling, by the following day, LeConte and his companion had already made it 30 miles down the trail. At least they did before having the misfortune of running into a small party of natives. They appeared friendly enough at first, but as soon as LeConte turned his back, they made off with his horses. That being the case, he and his pard had to walk the remaining 100-plus miles to Fort Yuma, but not before posting a note of their own to Royce, warning the hostiles were about. Now, as to whether or not Royce would live long enough to see this note remains unclear. Truth is, he and his family wouldn't get much further down the trail themselves before experiencing their own rendezvous with disaster. Most likely at the hands of the same bunch who had stolen LeConte's horses. The Oatmans spent their last night together as a family on a little sandbar in the middle of the Gila. Their team had gotten bogged down in the river trying to cross, and things appeared so dire that by that evening Royce broke down into tears as the children discussed what they'd do if attacked by Indians. And the next day, February 18th, 1851, their worst nightmare came to fruition. The oldest boy, Lorenzo, was the first to spot them. Close to 20 in total, bronzed and fierce-looking warriors clad in wolf skins and asking for tobacco. Royce told his family to remain calm as he packed and lit his pipe, passing it to his guests as they assured him in Spanish that they came in peace, just looking for a little food is all. A request that caused Royce to hesitate on account of he and his family already being strapped for victuals. Still, though, he would end up giving them a little bit of bread, but just weren't enough. They kept demanding more, and it wasn't long before they took it upon themselves to rummage through the wagon. Royce continued to hold firm, told them they had nothing else to give, at which point the soon-to-be hostiles formed a circle and began talking amongst themselves. Little did the Oatmans know, but they were planning their massacre. A massacre that was over in a matter of minutes. As soon as the warriors broke from their council, they fell upon the Oatmans with clubs and knives, and Olive had no other choice but to watch in horror as the majority of her family was cut down. Even her pregnant mother and the baby, Royce Jr., were slaughtered without mercy. Only ones who were spared were Olive and her 8-year-old sister, Mary Ann. Per Olive, quote, "When I recovered my thoughts, I could hardly realize where I was, and thought I was probably dying. I knew that all, or probably all, of my family had been murdered. Thus bewildered, confused, half conscious, and half insensible, I remained a short time. I know not for how long. Occasionally, a low moan would come from some member of my family as in a dying state. I distinguished the groans of my poor mother, and I sprang wildly towards her, but was held back by the merciless savage holding me in his cruel grasp, and lifting a club over my head, threatening me in the most taunting, barbarous manner." End quote. Now, the murderers would spend the better part of the next hour there at the wagon, just taking what they wanted and discarding the rest. At one point, Olive's older brother, Lorenzo, stirred and began moaning in pain, so They just dragged him over to the edge of a mesa and threw him off. As for Olive and Marianne, they were stripped of their shoes and forced to walk barefoot for the next 4 days, around 90 or so miles, as they were led to the main camp, which is thought to have been located somewhere in the Harkahala Mountains, a mountain range that I'm most likely not pronouncing correctly. Along the way, Marianne would grow weak and drop to her knees, only to then be beaten by her captors. It wasn't until Olive begged for mercy that one of them took to carrying Mary on his back. This was repeated again the following day. Once more, little 8-year-old Mary was viciously beaten before the sons of bitches just decided to go ahead and carry her. Now, as to which tribe this was, Olive would later identify her abductors as being Apaches. Bear in mind, though, that the term Apache was used as sort of a catch-all phrase for Native Americans in general there in the Southwest, especially the ones committing atrocities like what occurred to the Oatmans. The Apache did indeed have a ferocious reputation. They were very well known and well feared, so naturally they often took the brunt of the blame. That said, most historians tend to think that Olive's captors were Yavapai. That said, the Yavapai were very closely aligned with the Tonto Apache, to the extent that quite a few people back in the day considered the Yavapai to just be a band of the Western Apache. Today's episode of the Wild West Extravaganza is sponsored by BetterHelp. You know, people always think I'm joking when I say that my biggest fear in life is hiccups that won't go away. But seriously, think about it. I hate having the hiccups. Now imagine you're just stuck with them 24/7. And here's the scary part. It's a real thing. I read about this guy once that had the hiccups for 12 years. I'm getting freaked out just thinking about it. But what about you? What are you scared of? My irrational fear of hiccups aside, sometimes the scariest thing you can do is to not face your own fears. And when it comes to facing your fears, therapy can be a great tool. That's where my friends over at BetterHelp come into play. They'll teach you positive coping skills, how to set boundaries, and pretty much everything else you'll need to not only overcome your fears, but to become the best version of yourself that you could possibly be. And no, therapy is not just for those who've experienced major trauma. So if you're thinking about starting therapy, why not give BetterHelp a try? It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Overcome your fears with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/WildWest today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/WildWest. Now back to the show. Once they arrived at their destination, the sisters were forced to stand on a pile of branches and twigs while the villagers gathered around them. As drums began to sound, the Yavapai, men, women, and even children, circled the girls and started yelling and spitting and hurling insults. Some threw dirt and others just reached out and slapped them. Not sure what the significance of the twigs and branches were, but I assume it was to make them think they were going to be burnt alive. According to Olive, quote, "It seemed that their main ambition was to exhibit their superiority over us, and the low, earnest, intense hate they bore towards our race." End quote. And yeah, from then on, at least while they were still with the Yavapai, Olive and her sister were treated as mere slaves, forced to carry out mundane tasks like hauling water, gathering firewood, and digging up roots. If their work wasn't up to par, or if they just weren't moving fast enough, they were beaten. Thankfully, as time went on, their treatment would get slightly better. Not by much, but at least the physical attacks seemed to come with less frequency, especially once the girls began picking up on the lingo. Apparently, the Yavapai were very curious not only about white people and their way of life, but also just the world in general outside of their territory. They'd ask Olive and Mary stuff like, how many white people were there? Did white men have multiple wives? How did they treat their wives? How far did the ocean extend? Stuff like that. Things also got a little better once the sisters realized that complaining was considered a sign of weakness. And the only way that the Yavapai knew how to deal with complainers was to inflict pain. So naturally, once the girls stopped complaining, their beatings lessened. Little Mary was still having a pretty rough go of it, though. She had always been somewhat of a sickly child, even back east. Now that she was forced into slave labor with very little in the way of food or nourishment, her condition only worsened. And still, somehow, she managed, even to the point of impressing the Yavapai. Once again, per Olive, quote, "They became more lenient and merciful, especially to my sister. She always met their abuse with a mild, patient spirit and deportment, and with an intrepidity and fortitude beyond what might have been expected from her age. This spirit was plainly working its effect on some of them." End of quote. Now, later on that fall, the camp was visited by a delegation of Mohave. They attempted to trade for the sisters, but the Yavapai weren't having it. At least they weren't until the spring of 1852. That's when the Mohave sent in the chief's daughter, a young lady known as Topeka, and described by Olive as a beautiful, mild, and sympathizing woman, whose conduct and behavior towards the Yavapais bespoke a, quote, tutoring, intelligent, and sweetness of disposition that won their interest at once. And yeah, sure enough, they worked out a deal. 2 horses, 3 blankets, some beads, and a few bushels of beans later, and the Mohave were in possession of Olive and Mary Ann Oatman. Now, during this period, the Mohave likely numbered around 4,000, and they had been living there in Arizona for at least 1,000 years, if not longer. They were hunter-gatherers whose diet, believe it or not, seems to have been mostly plant-based. Sure, they'd hunt for small game when and where they could, but they were mostly dependent on the yearly flooding of the Colorado River to irrigate their crops that they lived on throughout the winter. Of course, this harvest was then supplemented by an assortment of wild seeds, roots, and even fish. Known to be kind and hospitable to strangers, the Mohave also had a reputation as fierce warriors. They raided their enemies, the Pimas and Maricopas, and had even known to have had a few violent encounters with American fur trappers. Just ask old Jedediah Smith how that turned out. Now, it would take around 10 days to make it back to the Mohave Valley, just a stone's throw away from California. And it's there where Olive and her sister were greeted far differently than they had been by the Yavapai. Rather than hurling insults and striking them, the Mohave instead threw a celebration. This was followed by the girls being taken in by the chief's family. His wife especially, a lady by the name of Espanio, would act as sort of a surrogate mother. Now, if you don't mind, just a couple more quick notes on the Mohave as a people. There are numerous accounts, just description after description, of the Mohave men being quite the masculine specimens. They all stood at least 6 feet tall, and according to at least one anthropologist who spent time with them in 1851, they were, quote, as fine a race of men physically, perhaps, as there is in existence. Oh my. For another explorer, quote, it was a real pleasure to see these finely developed forms as they came bounding towards us in immense leaps over stones and bushes, with the agility of black-tailed deer, and their pleasant, almost open looks, which even their frightful styles of decorations could not disguise, and to watch the perpetual good humor that seemed to prevail among them, their playing and romping with each other, and the shouts of laughter that followed the reciprocal jokes the whole day long. End quote. So there you go, not only a physically impressive people, but they also enjoyed a good laugh. What's more, according to historian Margot Mifflin, the Mohave were also very open with, well, let's just say romantic affections. I'll once again refer you to Mrs. Mifflin's excellent book, The Blue Tattoo, if you'd like to learn more. But suffice it to say, the Mohave were very fond of sexy time. Join the club, right? Only thing is, with the Mohave, it was not just relegated to behind closed doors. Like I said, they were very open about what Olive would describe as their quote-unquote shameful indecencies. Don't worry, we will come back to this topic a little bit later on, especially in regards to whether or not Olive herself partook in any of these air-quote indecencies. But for now, she and her sister were just trying to stay alive, and hopefully somewhat assimilate to life among the Mohave. And seeing as how they were no longer slaves, the girls enjoyed a hell of a lot more freedom than they had experienced with the Yavapai. And even better, they were no longer subjected to routine beatings. Still had to work though. You know the old saying, you don't work, you don't eat. Be that as it may, once the daily chores were done, Olive and Mary Ann would be free to join the others in playing games or even just swimming in the river. The sisters would also take to singing church hymns, which the Mohave really seemed to enjoy. So much so, they'd even pay the girls in beads or pieces of cloth to keep them singing. Now, speaking of freedom, Olive at one point was told that she was free to leave any time she wished. Only thing is, none of the Mohave would agree to guide her back to her own people. I guess they were worried about the soldiers causing trouble. And since Olive didn't really have any idea how to get back to civilization on her own, she and Mary were pretty much just stuck. Maybe. And this is where things start to get a little mysterious. As it turns out, there might be a little bit more to it than that. Even nowadays, it's fiercely debated as to whether or not the girls even wanted to leave. Alright, so hear me out. Back in 1854, almost exactly 3 years after the sisters were first taken captive, the Mohave were paid a visit by a Mr. Emil Weeks Whipple. You may recall him from the episode I did titled Blood Meridian Christmas Miracle. Link down below if you'd like to give it a listen. Whipple was a topographical engineer by trade, and his most recent adventure was mapping out a railroad from the Mississippi River all the way west to the Pacific. He was also somewhat of an amateur ethnologist, always looking to learn more about the indigenous and chronicle their quickly vanishing way of life, which is partly how he ended up camping with the Mohave. Now, for this particular job, Whipple had a force of over 100 men, fellow engineers, geologists, soldiers, even a few astronomers. They pitched their tents there in the valley for about 2 weeks in late February of 1854 and ended up doing quite a bit of trading. Important to point out that this was the main body of the tribe. The Oatman girls should have been present. Olive would later state that she had never left the main camp during her entire time with the Mohave. But although Whipple would remember seeing native slaves being held by the Mohave, he never mentioned casting eyes on any white women, much less a white girl. Which begs the question, were the Mohave purposely keeping Olive and Marianne from being discovered, or were the sisters hiding on their own accord? I mean, Whipple would have most definitely been their ticket to freedom. He likely could have purchased them outright, or if things were looking sketchy, he could have just waited and reported their whereabouts to the army. As it were, though, he had absolutely no clue that they were even there. But once again, why? Why didn't the girls try to reach out and make their presence known? There's no easy answer here, but I do think there's at least a few different possibilities. First, Whipple could have just simply mistaken the girls as being Native American. It had already been 3 years, so they would have been completely dressed in Mohave garb, which in the case of women just meant a willow bark skirt tied at the waist. Their hair was dyed black and their skin would have been deeply tanned. So yeah, I have no doubt that the Oatmans could have easily blended in with the crowd. But even if that is true, if they were there and Whipple just didn't realize they were white, why wouldn't the girls themselves at least try to make contact? As I mentioned earlier, there's always a chance that the Mohave just wouldn't allow it. Maybe they were scared of being punished, or maybe they thought they were even protecting the girls. Or maybe, just maybe, after 3 long years with the indigenous, Olive and Marianne were fully assimilated, and they didn't want to leave. I mean, think about it. The only family they had left was each other. Their adoptive mother treated them well, and who knows, maybe they were happy. Or at the very least, they just didn't have any pressing desires to return to white society. Not really all that far-fetched of an idea, especially considering that there are countless examples of this very sentiment among captives who had been adopted, especially female captives. Also, as much as I hate to say this, there's a very strong chance that Olive had been sexually assaulted during her stay with the Yavapai. I have no proof to back up this assertion, but once again, there are countless examples of this occurring in the Old West. I know she was only 14, but I don't think that was going to stop anybody. And if that was the case, then Olive could have possibly been too ashamed to speak with Whipple. Maybe she figured that if she was rescued, she'd just be considered damaged goods for the rest of her life. Then there's the fact that by the time Whipple arrived, Olive and her sister had already been permanently marked. From then on, no matter what they did or where they went, it'd be evident to all who cast eyes on them what they had been through. And yeah, I am referring to the famous Olive Oatman face tattoo. Now, Olive would later claim that she was given this tattoo as a slave, just a way for the Mohave to track her down if she ever managed to escape. We now know this is false, and such tattoos were given to female members of the tribe, not slaves. It was their belief that these markings would help their loved ones recognize them in the afterlife. According to Llewellyn Brockman, a tribal elder of the Mohave, these tattoos were voluntary. In other words, it wasn't something that would have been forced on Olive or her sister. They were tattooed because they wanted to be tattooed, or at the very least, just in order to solidify their standing among the tribe. Per tradition, the girls would have laid down in the grass with their heads resting in the artist's lap. He or she would have then drawn an outline with charcoal before puncturing their skin over and over with a cactus needle. The ink, which was a mix of weed juice and pulverized powder from a blue stone, would have then carefully been rubbed in. Would have probably taken around 2 or 3 hours, and for the next few days, the girls wouldn't be able to eat any solid food out of fear that the pinpricks wouldn't properly heal. Although we don't have any record of Marianne's tattoo, the one that Olive got consisted of a series of vertical bars stretching up from her jaw to her bottom lip, with a pair of shorter horizontal bars extending from the outside lines on both sides. A great example of this is the character Eva Oakes from AMC's Hell on Wheels, portrayed by actress Robin McLevy. I haven't seen much of the show, but just judging by the character's name and the pictures I've seen of her tattoo, it seems pretty obvious that she's based on Olive Oatman, especially considering that Eva's tattoo is an exact replica of what Olive had done, in addition to similar bars being tattooed on her upper arms. So yeah, while I'm sure getting tattooed seemed like a good idea, it could very well be that the girls were ashamed of their parents by the time Whipple arrived, and maybe that's why they didn't try to ask for help. Or finally, the only other reason I can really think of, and this also is a very real possibility, it could be that Olive had a Mohave husband. Hell, she may have even had children and she wasn't willing to abandon them. We will be discussing this theory more in depth here in a bit, but there are some, even historians, who firmly believe that Olive was married into the tribe, and they may be on to something. Now, this next part doesn't really have anything to do with the Oatmans. I just found it amusing, but apparently the Mohave women were grossed out by Whipple's beard and the beards of his men. Quote, "They gave us to understand in an unmistakable manner that they did not consider these appendages, their beards, at all attractive, though we were rather proud of them, as testifying to the length of our journey." He'd go on to write that the women would point and laugh, or sometimes even cover their mouths as if they were about to throw up just from looking at them. Hey, real quick, today's episode of the Wild West Extravaganza is brought to you by Manscaped. Look, bro, you and I both know that your balls deserve better, and that's where Manscaped comes into play, especially their Beard and Balls bundle, featuring the Lawnmower 5.0 and the Beard Hedger, a trimmer for the moneymaker, i.e. your face, and another for those boys downstairs. Trust me, I can personally attest that Manscaped really does work wonders. Not only will you be looking and feeling great, but you'll also be saving time. Ah, yeah, with Manscaped, you can say au revoir to endless passes, because this trimmer gets it right the first time, cutting through the bushiest of man bushes effortlessly while being gentle on the skin and your most delicate of delicates. But Josh, how is that even possible? I'm trying to tell you, okay? 2 interchangeable skin-safe blade heads. That's how. Oh, and did I mention that it's waterproof? In other words, you can trim those family jewels of yours right there in the shower. And that's just the Lawnmower 5.0. Don't even get me started on the Beard Hedger. Okay, fine, I'll get started. Whether you're going for a neat stubble or a full-on lumberjack look, the Beard Hedger's got you covered. And with a titanium-coated stainless steel T-blade with 20 different length options, you can tame that facial wilderness of yours into just about any style that you can imagine. And just like with the lawnmower, the Beard Hedger is waterproof. Really, it's a no-brainer. The Lawnmower 5.0 Ultra will ensure that you're always looking your best below the waist, while the Beard Hedger takes care of everything above. So what exactly are you waiting for? Get 20% off plus free shipping with the code WILDWEST at manscaped.com. That's 20% off plus free shipping with the code WILDWEST at manscaped.com. For the premium grooming experience, trust Manscaped. But yeah, disgusting beards aside, it wasn't long before Whipple and his men departed, and life got back to normal there in Mohave Valley. And honestly, for a time, things really did seem to be going well. To once again quote Margot Mifflin, the tribe had been on a roll. From the bountiful harvests of 1851 and 1853 to the productive exchange with Whipple in early 1854, and later the same year, the triumph of war with the Cocopas. But now things were about to change, for the girls and the Mojaves. The harvest of 1855 was bad, fatally so. After a spring drought prevented the banks of the river from overflowing, the crops came up late and the yield was paltry. Olive and Marianne were given seeds in the 30-foot square garden plot, where in previous years they had planted wheat, corn, and melon. It brought to our minds the extended grain fields that waved about our college in Illinois, wrote Olive, along with the May mornings when we had gone forth to the plow fields and followed barefooted in the new-turned furrow. Their labor of love had now turned to tough, necessary work, but the garden had failed. Mesquite mush ground in a stone pestle was becoming the tribe's only food, and even that was giving out. By the fall, food was being rationed, and 11-year-old Marianne was faltering. End of quote. Things got so bad that many of the Mohave were going entire days without food, or if they were lucky, maybe someone would happen upon a handful of wild berries or some bird eggs, but it was never much in the way of substance. And people were beginning to die, mostly children, literally starving to death. And sadly, Marianne Oatman was one of them. Olive stayed by her side, as did a few of the other women, including Topeka and their adopted mother, Espanio. They attempted to comfort Marianne as much as possible, but I guess she was just too far gone. And there were just so many instances of Olive referring to her sister as being sickly, even before the famine, so I assumed there were underlying issues that led to her untimely demise. The lack of food damn sure didn't help matters. Now, the Mohave cremate their dead, but out of respect, they allowed Olive to bury her sister in the ways of the white people. They dug a grave for her in that little garden where the sisters had toiled, and gave Olive room to mourn, or at least as much as she was capable of mourning, while herself being on the verge of starvation. According to Olive, she grew so weak that she could barely walk. Quote, "I was rapidly drooping and becoming more and more anxious to shut my eyes to all about me, and sink into a sweet, untroubled sleep beneath the green-carpeted valley. This was the only time in which, without any reserve, I really longed to die. And there's a good chance she would have followed in Mary's little footsteps had it not been for the kindness of Espanio and Topeka. Even as their own family members were starving, they shared their remaining cornmeal with Olive. Just a little. There wasn't much to go around in the first place, not even enough to save the already ill Mary Ann, but it was enough to at least see that Olive didn't perish. You know, starvation is such a foreign thing to us nowadays, at least here in the United States. Just a few days ago, I treated myself to a cheeseburger and a large order of fries. Over 1,000 calories consumed in less than 5 minutes. An overindulgence on my part that likely could have sustained Olive for over a week. Hell, most of us throw away enough food to feed an entire village. Now, unbeknownst to Olive, as all this was going down, her older brother Lorenzo was doing his level best to find her. During that initial attack back in 1851, the then 15-year-old Lorenzo had taken a pretty nasty blow to the head, followed by the Yavapai throwing him off a cliff, but miraculously he survived. The next morning he had one hell of a headache and blood was still oozing out of his ears, but at least he was able to move. Not well at first, ended up falling down as soon as he got to his feet, but in time he was able to make his way back to the wagon and scarf up a few crumbs of bread. Woke up as the sun was setting, surrounded by wolves that he had to scare away by throwing rocks at them. Luckily, he was soon rescued by a pair of friendly Pimas who agreed to take him back to Maricopa Wells. On the way there, they ran into the Wilders and the Kellys, which was the last two families they had been traveling with before the Oatmans struck off on their own. Matter of fact, it would be the Wilder and Kelly men who rode out to bury Royce and the others. I say buried, but they didn't have no shovels and ended up just covering them with rocks. Once Lorenzo was able to travel, he then accompanied the Wilders and Kellys to Fort Yuma, which at that time was under the command of Major Samuel P. Heinzelman. Remember, Royce Oatman had sent a note to Heinzelman asking for assistance, which the entomologist LeConte had faithfully delivered. Only thing was, Heinzelman refused to help, saying that all of his horses were being used for some other purpose. He finally came around and sent a couple of soldiers, but it was far too late and the Oatmans had already been attacked. Rather than send out even more soldiers to locate the missing girls, Heinzelman just said that it wasn't his problem. And I guess, legally speaking, he had a point, as the site of the massacre technically was on Mexican soil. But I still find it astonishing that he didn't at least try to rescue the girls. And to be honest, this Heinzelman guy, by all accounts, was just a real douchebag. First, he blamed the fate of the Oatmans on LeConte, who he referred to as Dr. Bugs. Then he decided that the entire ordeal lay on the shoulders of Royce, writing, quote, Oatman was of an obstinate and contrary disposition, and would take advice from no one. He was warned of the imprudence of going it alone, end quote. And that may be true, but what's the point of having the damn army stationed at a frontier outpost if they won't at least go searching for missing girls? The surgeon there at Fort Yuma, Dr. Henry Hewitt, ended up filing charges against Heinzelman for neglect of duty and cruel and inhuman conduct. Hell, the second in command, Lieutenant Thomas Sweeney, sided with the doc, which really tells you all you need to know about Major Heinzelman. Now, the Kellys and Wilders would stay there at Fort Yuma for a spell, but they ended up pushing west into California, sans Lorenzo. He stayed behind, still hoping to rescue his sisters, but he too would head to California a few months later with Doc Hewitt. According to Lorenzo, the doctor became sort of a father figure. Quote, at a time when, but for his counsel and his affectionate oversight, I might have turned out to wreck upon the cold world. End quote. By that fall, Lorenzo, who was still just 15 years old, had managed to find himself a warehouse job in San Francisco. Wouldn't last long due to a back injury, and after Doc Hewitt departed for the East, Lorenzo was essentially on his own. Had a string of menial jobs, everything from prospecting to farming, and all the while doing his best to bring attention to the plight of Olive and Mary Ann. This kid was barely literate, by the way. I've read a few of his letters, and the spelling is damn near indecipherable. Like, we're talking first grade level. Doesn't matter, though. He knew his sisters were out there somewhere, possibly still alive, and he wasn't about to give up on them on account of a shoddy education. So he continued writing letters. First to the military authorities at Fort Yuma, for all the good that would do, then to the powers that be in California, even the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington, D.C. It wasn't until Major Heinzelman was replaced by Brevet Major George Thomas that Lorenzo's letters began taking effect, but not by much. Turns out Thomas wasn't all that fired up to mount a rescue attempt either. Lorenzo would travel back to the fort to question travelers, but he'd have to wait till the spring of 1855 to get any sort of word on his sisters. And even then, it was tentative at best, just that there were 2 white girls supposedly living with the Mohave. Several months later, this was backed up by a California rancher who publicly claimed that the new commander over at Fort Yuma, Thomas's replacement, Major Martin Burke, had refused an offer to purchase the girls back for the mere price of a few blankets. As it turns out, that last part wasn't true. Doesn't even really make sense. I mean, why in the hell would an officer refuse to secure a captive's release for such a cheap price? Nothing of the sort ever occurred, but the rancher's allegations did cause enough of a controversy to spur on an investigation. It also lit a fire under the major's ass to send emissaries out to the local tribes fishing for information, something that, in my opinion, should have been done years prior, but alas, nobody asked me. When the runners returned to Fort Yuma, they came bearing the news that while there had indeed been 2 white girls living with the Mohave, one had recently passed away, and that the other was married to the chief. There goes that M word again. Invigorated with this latest development, Lorenzo sent a petition to California Governor J. Neely Johnson, asking for, quote, men or means by which men can be obtained to rescue the unfortunate girls from the custody of these lawless and piratical Mojaves, end quote. And you'll never guess what happened. Johnson refused to help. Of course he did. And he instead told Lorenzo to write another letter to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which he did, but once again, his pleas were ignored. Very frustrating situation. I can't even imagine how Lorenzo must have felt. And to be honest, had it not been for a friendly member of the Quitsan tribe, aka the Yuma, a guy known as Francisco, there ain't no telling how long Olive would remain with the Mohave. As it were, Francisco confided in the post carpenter there at Fort Yuma, Henry Grinnell, saying that he knew where Olive was being held, and Grinnell, fully aware that the army wasn't going to be of assistance, concocted somewhat of an outlandish plan of his own to secure Olive's rescue. He'd send Francisco to the Mohave with some beads and blankets to trade for Olive, and if that didn't work, if they asked too steep of a price, or if they just flat out refused, Francisco was to inform the Mohave that if they didn't let Olive go, then 5 million Americans would descend upon their villages and slaughter them all. And that right there is one hell of a bluff. Not 500 men, not 5,000 men, but 5 million. And as crazy as it sounds, it did work. After several days of negotiations, they settled on a price of 2 horses and the aforementioned beads and blankets. According to Olive, her release was met with a variety of emotions from the Mohave. Some looked at her in pity, some laughed, saying that she'd regret leaving, and others seemed genuinely happy for her. A few, like Espanio and Topeka, were absolutely devastated. I mean, hell, they really did consider Olive to be a member of the family. Now, the trip from Mohave Valley to Fort Yuma would end up taking around 10 or 11 days. It was Olive, Francisco, a few of Francisco's cousin, a Mohave man known as Muskmelon, and finally, Olive's adopted sister, Topeka. They arrived on the outskirts of the fort on the evening of February 27th, 1856, 5 years to the month since Olive and Mary Ann were first taken. She and her chaperone spent that night under the stars, and the next morning, Francisco sent word to Grinnell that Olive had arrived and for him to send out a dress for her, which Grinnell did, personally delivering the dress himself. According to Margot Mifflin in the Blue Tattoo, quote, he hurried down to the crossing, sped across Yeager's Ferry, and stepped off to see that Olive already had an audience. A collection of Quitsan Indians, seized with curiosity, had converged on the riverbank with their trademark quivers on their backs, knives at their hips, and rings in their ears and noses. Wearing only a bark skirt, Olive was sitting on the ground, hiding her face in her hands. Tan, tattooed, and painted, she was all but unrecognizable as a 19-year-old white woman. The straight line of a vertical blue tattoo ascended each of her bare upper arms. Her naturally light brown hair was as dark as a Mojave's, dyed black with the gum from the mesquite trees. When Grinnell approached, she cried quietly into her hands, but let him lead her to the water, where she washed and changed into the calico dress an officer's wife had sent from the fort. Now free of face paint and hair dye, and wearing Anglo garb, she was ready, or at least dressed, for her return. End of quote. As Olive approached Fort Yuma, the soldiers began cheering and firing off cannons in celebration. This was followed by a thorough questioning from Major Burke, sort of an after-action report as Olive described the massacre and her life among the indigenous. Although her English was shaky, she did remember her family name and that she had 6 siblings. Other details were a bit more jumbled, though. For instance, she recalled her age at the time of capture as being 11, when in reality she was 14. Then she oddly mentioned that her older sister Lucy's husband was also killed in the massacre. Only thing is, Lucy wasn't married. Fact of the matter is, Olive went through a very traumatic experience, much of which she likely blocked out of her head, just as a survival mechanism. Does go to show just how untrustworthy our memories can be, though. As for her time with the natives, she described how the Yavapai, who she labeled as Apache, badly mistreated her, but the Mohave were very kind, even giving them credit for saving her life after Marianne's passing. Once the debriefing was over, that's when Burke let Olive know that her brother Lorenzo was alive and well and looking forward to seeing her. Remember, last time Olive had cast eyes on him, he was gushing blood from both ears and taking a short trip off a high cliff. Olive had assumed he was dead, and this revelation for Burke caused such a shock that she had to lay down. Now, in the weeks that followed, the press would have a field day reporting on this story. As news spread, folks all across the country began offering to take Olive in. The Sisters of Mercy out of San Francisco promised to, quote, wean her from all savage tastes or desires to return to Indian life. And the Collins family, who had also traveled with the Oatmans out of Illinois, petitioned a judge to have her sent to live with them in San Diego. In the meantime, Olive found herself in the very capable hands of the legendary Great Western, a lady described by Texas Ranger Rip Ford as being able to whip any man, fair fight or foul. She could shoot a pistol better than anyone in the region, and at blackjack could outplay or outcheat the slickest professional gambler. Chances are, if you're a fan of Larry McMurtry or Cormac McCarthy, you've probably already heard of the Great Western, but you might not know she was a real person, and honestly, she deserves an episode all of her own. But if you don't mind, I'd love to share a brief bio. I think you'll find her to be as interesting as I do. Born Sarah Knight, sometime either in 1812 or 1813, she apparently experienced one hell of a growth spurt during her formative years. As an adult, the Great Western stood at least 6 feet tall, weighed in at over 200 pounds, and was said to have been a, quote, remarkably large, well-proportioned, strong woman, of strong nerves and great physical power. And yeah, it was due to her size that she got the nickname the Great Western, a nod to the SS Great Western, which just so happened to be the largest passenger ship in existence. At least it was, till it got eclipsed by another ship in 1839. Nevertheless, the name stuck. Now, there is a ton of sketchy info out there on Sarah, and I don't want to get too sidetracked here, but the long and short of it is that she began traveling with the Army as a laundress and a nurse. She had a series of military husbands, which is how she wound up with her various last names like Bowman or Borginness. But it was during the Mexican-American War that the Great Western really made her bones. More specifically, during the siege of Fort Brown. Rather than hide with the other women down in the bunker, Sarah requisitioned a rifle and busied herself caring for the wounded and delivering coffee to the troops. Doesn't seem like that big of a deal, but this was during a very active battle, and Sarah was dodging bullets left and right. Even had a few close calls when her bonnet was perforated, and the bread tray she was carrying stopped a ball from a Mexican musket. 7 months later, she did pretty much the same thing during the Battle of Buena Vista, just delivering food to the beleaguered troops, assisting the wounded, and even helping to load rifles. Legend has it that she killed a Mexican soldado after he sliced at her with a saber, but how true that is, I do not know. At one point towards the end of the war, when she was in between husbands, the Great Western was told she couldn't continue traveling with the Army unless she was married to a soldier. So what did she do? She hopped into the saddle and began riding throughout the camp, hollering, "Who wants a wife with $15,000 and the biggest leg in Mexico? Come, my beauties, don't all speak at once. Who is the lucky man?" Now, I don't know how literal that leg reference was, or what it even means for that matter, but a brave dragoon did step forward and take her up on that offer, on the condition that their marriage be officiated by a priest, to which the Great Western replied, "Bring your blanket to my tent tonight, and I'll learn you to tie a knot that'll satisfy you, I reckon." Once again, I don't really know what that means, or what it has to do with a priest, but something tells me the private dragoon didn't get much sleep that night. Eventually, the Great Western reached Fort Yuma and opened up a restaurant, most likely supplementing her income by doing a little whoring on the side. In all fairness, I don't think that it's been definitively proven that she engaged in prostitution, but there are many first-hand accounts where Sarah is described as both a prostitute and a pimp. Even before reaching Fort Yuma, she was known as El Paso's first madam. Rough exterior notwithstanding, the Great Western was said to have had a heart of gold. Over the years, she ended up adopting more than a few Mexican and Native American orphans, and sure enough, when Olive Oatman was rescued, it would be the Great Western who took her in, acting as yet another surrogate mother, at least temporarily. It took weeks for Lorenzo to learn of Olive's rescue, but just as soon as he found out, he rushed to Fort Yuma as quickly as possible. And after what I can only imagine was an emotional reunion, he took Olive back with him to his home in El Monte. Now, the Thompson family, which was yet another family who initially began traveling west with the Oatmans, they also resided there in El Monte. So thankfully, Olive did have some familiar faces to greet her. According to Susan Thomas, Olive was a, quote, grieving, unsatisfied woman who somehow shook one's belief in civilization. She was more savage than civilized, and she often told me that she would like to see some of her old friends, even if they were Indians, end quote. In contrast, others noted that she had a ladylike deportment, pleasing manners, and an amiable disposition. As for the papers, they would either describe her tattoos as being disfiguring or just simply remark on her beauty. And judging by the photos of Olive that still exist, she was not a bad-looking woman by any means. Still, though, with those tattoos on her face, she was treated like a spectacle pretty much everywhere she went. Wasn't long before Olive began covering her chin with her hands anytime she met someone new, and later in life she would take to wearing a veil when appearing in public. According to an 1856 article out of the Los Angeles Star, people would, quote, rush to see her and stare at her, with about as much of a sense of feeling as they would to a show of wild animals. Now from El Monte, Lorenzo and Olive would move further north to the town of Gasburg. It's there where she met a young Methodist preacher with the pompous-sounding name of Royal Byron Stratton, and it was Stratton who was responsible for publishing Olive's story, a book titled Life Among the Indians that consisted of first-hand accounts from both Olive and her brother. And you better believe that Stratton added his own little touch of flair. Certain facts were omitted, like the Oatmans being Mormon, certain events were exaggerated, and others just seemingly made up out of thin air. Also, the Mohave weren't portrayed nearly as good as they had been during Olive's initial statements back at Fort Yuma. For reasons unknown, she began to insist that even among the Mohave, she had been a slave, and that her tattoos were the markings of a slave. I know I touched on this earlier, but we now know that is not true. Those facial tattoos, 100%, were relegated to female members of the tribe, not slaves. Why Stratton and Olive were so hell-bent on pushing the slave narrative, I can't say. Other than to maybe squash rumors that Olive had received the tattoos willingly, or that she was living with the tribe willingly, or as early newspaper articles claimed, that she was married into the tribe. And yes, we are about to discuss that very thing, I promise. First, though, I don't really feel like I'm doing service to just how riddled with inaccuracies Olive's book was. I mean, it is just falsehood after falsehood. Once again, how much of that had to do with her, as opposed to the guy that actually wrote the book, Stratton, I don't know. And either way, the book proved extremely popular. And thanks to its popularity, in the years that followed, both Stratton and Olive would tour the U.S. extensively giving lectures. From Indiana to Ohio, Illinois, Massachusetts, Michigan, New York City, people were traveling far and wide to get a glimpse of Olive's tattoos and to hear her speak on her captivity. You gotta keep in mind that this was way before tattoos became popular. There was this guy named James O'Connell who claimed to have received his tattoos while shipwrecked on the Carolina Islands. And when he got back to the United States, just the mere sight of him caused children to run away screaming. And local preachers would even warn pregnant women not to cast eyes on him lest their brood come out looking the same. So yeah, Olive's appearance would have been quite the draw during the 1850s. Truth be told, it's widely believed that she was the first American woman to publicly reveal such markings. Now, Olive would end up using the proceeds from these speaking gigs to further her education. In 1861, she enrolled in a 2-year college in Albany, and in her spare time, she continued to tour. At least she did till she met her future husband, John Fairchild. They actually met during one of Olive's lectures in Michigan and bonded over their shared experiences. Although John had never been abducted, his brother had recently been killed by hostiles while driving cattle in New Mexico. The pair were engaged in July of 1865 and made things official the following November, after which Olive called it quits on the speaking circuit and cut off all contact with Reverend Stratton. Mr. Fairchild even went around and bought up every copy of the book that he could find and threw them in the burn pile. In 1872, the couple moved down to Sherman, Texas, where Fairchild made his fortune in part by helping to found a bank. Locals would recall that while he and Olive seemed to be a romantic couple, they rarely socialized. This is about the same time that Olive took to wearing that veil in public. She busied herself with charity work, became a devout Episcopalian, and in 1873, she and John adopted a 3-week-old baby girl they named Mary Elizabeth. And yeah, it's there in Sherman where Olive would live out the remainder of her days, never fully able to put her past behind her, and, if her letters are any indication, plagued by loneliness. Although happily married, Olive would often pine for her dead family. especially her mother. And there are some who think that she even mourned for the Mohave she left behind. As the years went on, Olive became more and more of a recluse, but she apparently never lost her humanity. According to a family friend, quote, "I used to sit by the fire when a child, watching Mrs. Fairchild and admiring her kind and gentle ways. Her sweet face was surrounded by beautiful white hair like a halo. The tattoo had faded to a pale blue, and of course I was so used to seeing it that I didn't even notice it anymore." End of quote. Olive passed away in March of 1903 at just 65 years of age. Her husband John, still fearful that the Mohave would try to get her back, had Olive's casket sealed in iron. He'd follow her to the grave just 5 years later, and Lorenzo had already preceded both of them back in 1901. As for their adopted child, Mary, she moved to Detroit, got hitched, and had a baby of her own, a daughter she named Olive. Now, as for the Mohave, I think this goes without saying, but life had changed drastically for them following Olive's release. Although they remained relatively cut off from white society during her stay with them, this would change shortly after her rescue. More and more settlers began passing through their territory, trampling over their crops and acting like they owned the place. The Mohave put up with it for a spell, but eventually they retaliated, striking a wagon train and killing 8 travelers. The army responded by putting a fort right there in the Mohave Valley, which prompted yet another attack, one that saw at least a dozen warriors killed. Still others would fall in an ill-fated campaign against the Pima and Maricopa, including many of the friendly Yuma like Francisco. In the end, the Mohave were split up. Some were sent to a reservation outside of the town of Parker, Arizona, and others were removed to the Colorado Indian Reservation near Needles, California. As for the Yavapai, I do feel like it's only fair to point out that their vicious attack on the Oatmans wasn't really something that they normally did. Don't get me wrong, they did occasionally engage in warfare, but for the most part, they kept their distance from the migrants. Really, I think it was just bad luck on the part of the Oatmans that they passed through Yavapai territory during starving times. Also, if Royce were able to put up more of a fight, or maybe if he just had another man there with him, I do think the outcome would have been different. Like I said, just bad luck all around. The Yavapai would be forced onto the San Carlos Reservation in 1875, and over the next 25 years, their population would shrink down to just 200. Okay, before we call it a day, let's go ahead and address the tattooed elephant in the room. Did Olive have a Mohave husband? And if so, did they have any children? Well, a lady I mentioned earlier, Susan Thomas, who Olive stayed with after moving to California, claimed that Olive confided in her that she was not only married to the chief's son, but that she had left 2 children behind when she was rescued. And then there's the respected author and historian Charlotte Hall. Shout out to the great Bob Bose Bell over at True West Magazine for this next little tidbit. According to Mr. Bell, in 1904, Charlotte privately told a researcher that Olive did in fact have 2 children, and that one of them, at least as late as the year 1904, would still regularly pay visits to Fort Yuma. So there you go. Sounds pretty convincing, right? Especially considering Olive's nickname. Oh boy. Earmuffs just in case you've got youngsters listening, but among the Mohave, Olive was known as Spansa, which roughly translates to rotten vagina or sore vagina. I am not making this up. Obviously, we can only speculate, but at first glance, just going by that nickname, it would appear that Olive, if she wasn't married, was at the very least sexually active. But then again, devil's advocate, it could just mean that she wasn't up to par with Mohave grooming standards. After all, we're talking about a people who practically lived in the river during the summer. The Mohave were big-time swimmers and they bathed themselves on a daily basis. In contrast, Olive came to them as a captive, beaten and half-starved by the Yavapai, so I doubt she was as fresh as a flower. Or it could have been as simple as her being on her period when she first arrived there in the Mohave Valley. Or maybe she picked up an STI from the Yavapai. There's really no way of knowing where this name originated from. That said, Michael Sosi, the director of the Colorado Indian Museum, is of the opinion that, since Olive was adopted, given a clan name and tattoos, she almost certainly was also initiated sexually into the tribe. In the book I keep mentioning, The Blue Tattoo, Mr. Sosi is quoted as saying that he believes Olive's Mohave name indicates that she was very sexually active, implying that she was having so much sex that she was sore and had a vulgar smell, or that she was with someone so virile that he was wearing her out. And Mr. Sosi is not alone in these sentiments. Brian McGinty, author of the book The Oatman Massacre, also thinks there's a good chance that Olive left some kids behind. Once again, big shout out to Bob Bosbell. I'll link to Mr. Bell's entire blog post down below, as well as a video he made on the Oatman Massacre, but he actually reached out to Brian McGinty via email. And what follows is McGinty's response. Quote, I believe she may have had children. There were reports that she did, as detailed in my book. Her unhappiness in latter years may be explained by sorrow over the loss of her children. The eagerness with which she greeted Irataba in New York in 1864 may also be linked to that. However, there have been denials by the Mohaves. Perhaps they wanted to avoid recriminations from whites. To the best of my knowledge, there has never been convincing proof that Olive did, or convincing proof that she did not, have Mohave children. The question is vital to understanding the tragic story of Olive Oatman and should not be dismissed out of hand. Some convincing proof may eventually emerge. I hope researchers will continue to pursue the question. End quote, and well said. By the way, I failed to mention this earlier, but when Mr. McGinty referenced Olive's meeting with Irataba was a very influential chief of the Mohave. He visited Washington, D.C. in 1864 to see President Lincoln. And while he was back east, he also made stops in Philadelphia and New York City. And it just so happens that when he was in New York, Olive came to see him. They greeted each other warmly and had a long conversation speaking in Mohave. There are some who think that the reason Olive paid the visit to Irataba was in order to inquire about her children who she had left behind. But once again, as Mr. McGinty pointed out, this is just speculation. Okay, so just to sum things up, you've got Olive's Mohave name, which certainly does have a sexual undertone. You've got a ton of rumors of her having children with Mohave, some of which were published by early newspaper reports following her release. Then there's her mysterious meeting with Chief Irataba, and finally, at least one of Olive's own friends, Susan Thompson, said that she admitted to being married with children. But what about evidence to the contrary? Well, for starters, Olive herself would never admit to any such thing, at least not publicly, and neither would the Mohave. Truth be told, just the mere fact that she was white could have disqualified her in the eyes of the tribe. Apparently, the Mohave believed that sleeping with other races could lead to illness or even death. On the rare occasions that they did marry outsiders, the men were already old and thus not really worried about the consequences. Mohave elder Llewellyn Brockman, who sadly passed away in 2006, was of the opinion that if Olive had kids, it would have been an extremely memorable event and something that would have been passed down throughout the generations. In other words, if Olive was married into the tribe, or especially if she had Mohave children, then Mr. Brockman would have heard about it. You know, this is just one of those mysteries that'll likely never be solved. And it could very well be that the answer is somewhere in the middle. Maybe Olive was married when she was with the Mohave, but she just wasn't physically able to bear children, which might explain why she and John Fairchild adopted rather than having any of their own. You know, it's funny. If this was the other way around and Olive was a man who was fully assimilated into the tribe by the time he reached adulthood, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. It'd just be a given. Of course he had sex. But since Olive's a female, we automatically assume that if there was sex of any kind, it could not possibly have been consensual. This is partly due to the times, right? Sex outside of marriage was a big social taboo back in those days, at least for women. And besides, the so-called civilized society that Olive came from would have recognized a Mohave marriage as being legit. Even if they did, she would have still been ostracized for dipping outside of her race. You know, we're talking about a young girl who saw her family massacred. In the blink of an eye, she became the sole guardian of her 8-year-old sister. You got to imagine that she partly blamed herself when Mary Ann passed away. Whatever Olive did or did not do to survive these circumstances, whatever joy she may have found in the embrace of another, is, in my opinion, irrelevant. She survived. That's really all that matters, right? And she went on to live a very long life. The stories are true, a long life that included helping others in need, working with charities, and raising her own adopted child. Okay, one final thing. This also comes from the great Bob Bosbell. Once again, link down below to watch the entire video, but as it turns out, that prophet James Colin Brewster, the guy who led the Oatmans west to begin with, he may not have been as totally full of manure as I initially thought. Now, this is crazy. Remember, according to him, the area around what's now Yuma, Arizona, was to be a fertile, lush paradise, which was the exact opposite of how it was back in the 19th century. Back then, it really was just a desolate wasteland. However, thanks to Teddy Roosevelt, it wouldn't stay that way. In 1903, Roosevelt turned the land around Fort Yuma over to the Bureau of Land Reclamation, who in turn irrigated over 58,000 acres in what's now Yuma County, Arizona, aka what Prophet Brewster claimed would be the land of Bashan. Thanks to these efforts, that area now boasts of year-round farming. In fact, somewhere around 90% of North America's leafy greens, grown between the months of November and April, come from Yuma County. Per a 2023 article from the Arizona Farm Bureau website, Yuma is to agriculture what Silicon Valley is to computers. So, I guess Brewster was just off by a few decades. You know what they say, even a blind squirrel can find a nut on occasion. Alright, I think that about does it on Olive Oatman. What do you think? Was she really married? Did she really leave kids behind with the Mohave? Or what do you think happened? Hit me up at josh@wildwestextra.com and let me know what's on your mind. If you'd like to learn more about today's topic, check out the 2 books I mentioned, The Blue Tattoo by not Olive Oatman. I have it written here in my notes that it was written by Olive Oatman. It was not. It was written by Margot Mifflin. And check out The Oatman Massacre by Brian McGinty. Also, make sure you're subscribed to the 100% free Wild West newsletter. Link down below or go there directly at wildwestnewsletter.com. Like I said, it is 100% free. You don't even have to sign up if you don't want to. And I recently put out a new edition with photos of some of the people we've discussed today. Olive, her brother Lorenzo, and several of the Mohave. All right, thank you so much for listening. Till next time, try not to wipe out anybody's family, okay? Don't take anybody hostage or prisoner. And if you got to get a tattoo, give it a little bit of thought, huh? There's a lot of people walking around right now, Chinese letters on their body that do not mean what they think it means. And there's a lot of tribal tattoos that are no longer all that fashionable. All right, till next time, adios.